Okay. Yes. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to this Switch Asia Rare Powered webinar. Uh, I am Sara Gabbai, communication expert in the Switch Asia program. And today I'm very pleased to have you with us for this important event. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes while we also wait for other participants to log into our session. The webinar will last about 2 hours. It will be in English language. For now, participants will be muted and also your webcams will be off in order to avoid any interferences. Don't worry, the recording will be available to all shortly after our session. And for those who attend the full webinar, we will also issue a certificate of attendance. During the presentations, we will create checkpoints with you. So you will be, you can pop into questions into the Q&A chat box on the right side. We will try our best to answer all your questions. If we have more to address, you can always write to me, and my email is already shared on screen and also in the emails you will receive from our webinar platform. Without further ado, I want to give the word to our team leader, Dr. Zinaida Fadiva, for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and greetings to all participants, to all facilitators, panelists from Switch Asia SCP facility, and generally from Switch Asia. We, as a change community work champions, I would say, or contributors, who model new practices of SCP through grant projects on the ground, as well as assisting governments in developing SCP policies that help to upscale such programs, are very pleased with today's participation and today's partnerships. And let me start by making one obvious point that we are all here today as we are all motivated by common ambition. And that is how to address the triple planetary crisis related to climate change, waste of resources, and to loss of biodiversity and ecosystems. And we know very well that some of these actions could be reached through well-established desired measures, for example, for climate change mitigation and adaptation. But yet, not many of those measures are being implemented. At the same time, the ways of implementing circular economy systems are yet to be developed to their convincing scale, I would say, and in innovative way. We need actions to overcome resistance to move forward, and we need new habits of thinking and new ways of creativity. And that is the reason we joined hands today with RARE, the organization that works with design of programs and processes in a more effective way as it draws on the insights from the behavioral sciences. We are very glad here to be on the panel and listen to the insights of RARE's remarkable work from three representatives of the RARE team, which is Philip Bujold, who is a behavioral scientist from the behavioral and environmental team of RARE. With us also Sam Gray, who represents Pride on Our Plate project. This is a project of Switch Asia. And also, of course, with Xiang Li, who is really having her hands on the ground for the Pride on Our Plate program. So colleagues, again, pleasure to be in this partnership, talking about our ambitions and more effective and impactful ways of moving forward with insights from behavioral sciences and behavioral practices. And we are, of course, welcoming all of the participants, which are now nearing, number of us is nearing 130, with numbers growing up. We are, of course, also greeting those of us who are going to watch this record after the seminar is over. Welcome, everybody. And Philip, Sam, and Xiang, the floor is over to you.
Perfect. So I'll jump in here. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'll be the first speaker today for the webinar. So my name is Philippe Bugeaud, and I'm a former behavioral neuroscientist, now turned conservationist. So I'm a behavioral scientist at RARE, as we were just saying. And essentially my job is to translate the scientific evidence that comes out of the behavioral sciences into conservation and environmental programs. So I'll be your first teacher for today. So the first thing we will be covering is essentially how you can think about building behaviorally informed programs. And so to do that, we'll first cover the process we call behavior-centered design. So that's RARE's framework for thinking about behavioral science in program design. Then Xiang will give you a great example of our behaviorally informed work through the Pride on Our Plates program. And after the break, we'll cover the behavioral insights relevant to the work that we do and how we can incorporate those behavioral insights in our own behavior change programs. Before jumping into that, though, I want to give a quick introduction to RARE. So as an organization, RARE has been around for about 45 years now. And in that time, we have led hundreds of behavior change campaigns around the world. And so through our work, we've managed to solidify ourselves as the leading behavior change organization in conservation. And though we started off as a biodiversity conservation NGO, and now we work in a bunch of different areas from reducing carbon emissions to smart agriculture, all the way through fisheries management. So a bit more recently in 2017, we launched the Center for Behavior in the Environment, which is where Xiang, Sam, and I work. And we work there to support essentially our own programs and other organizations like you today in integrating behavioral science into your own work. Let's try the next slide. Perfect. So that means that essentially every day we work on the problems that you can see on the screen right now. You can see things like what people eat, what people buy, what people throw out, different choices that people make all the time. And though all of these problems seem very different, the solutions for fixing them are all quite similar. Someone, somewhere, has to change their behavior. And so our job is to keep them to help them essentially make a different choice. So how do we tackle this? How do we go about designing interventions that change behavior? Well, more often than not, we start this process with a predicted result change, or maybe a term more familiar to some of you, a theory of change, what I'm showing here on the screen. So we as organizations create programs and activities essentially that help people understand the why or the how they should change their behavior. Some people do, and then we measure the impact that this change in behavior has had on these social and environmental outcomes that we work on. By designing programs in this way, though, we make two crucial mistakes. The first is that we tend to ignore the very interesting step that happens between program activities and behavior. The one highlighted here in green, it's the psychological or the social context in which we find our audience, and also the context that we want to create to make our programs as effective as they can be. I'm talking about here the beliefs, the attitudes, the knowledge, and the capacity that people have, basically to have present in order for behavior change to happen. The second mistake, then, is directly linked to the first. Because traditional theories of change tend to ignore this context, we tend to rely on assumptions. We don't plan activities based on our understanding of what drives behavior. We do it based on what the behavior is. And so most of our efforts are exactly that. They're telling people what our target behavior is. So what I want to do for this first session is equip you with the tools and frameworks needed to add this green box here in your own intervention design. And at RARE, the way we do this is through a process that we call behavior-centered design. So BCD for short, that's the shorthand I'll be using today. And I was talking about creating theories of change earlier. BCD is our process to think about them internally, and it's also the process that we teach ourselves. So we mix through that the best of behavioral science and design thinking to help identify the most effective behavior change interventions for a given problem and audience. Some of you might be familiar with methods like human-centered design or design thinking. The strengths of these approaches are that they put people really at the heart of the solutions, and they offer creative methodologies to think about these problems. What we did on top of that is incorporating a behavioral lens to the work that we do. And so that's what we'll cover today, or really this framework called BCD. Before jumping into that though, I did promise the presenters here, the host, that I would do a warm-up poll. So here it is. I want to test the poll functionality with all of you. In the poll sidebar, let me see if I can get this to work. I'll start the poll now. Can you indicate if, yes, you've heard of BCD, no, you haven't, but you've heard of its individual components, or no, you're new to all of this, but no matter what, you want to learn. That's why you're here today. So I think the poll has been opened on the sidebar. Oh, perfect. It's filling up very quickly. So I'll give 20 seconds to do that. And that'll give us a good feeling of who's familiar with the topic and who isn't. Still going up. I'm impressed. You guys are very quick. Okay, so I'll keep talking while this is going. We are almost at a tie here between the people who have heard about the individual components or the people who have not heard about any of this. And a few less people have heard about BCD, but I'm quite impressed by the amount of people that have. So today I'm really going to be covering things for all three types of people here, the people that have heard about BCD, the people who haven't, and the people that are a bit familiar with the concepts that make up BCD. Next slide, sorry. So beyond the buzzwords, let's see what BCD really is, and it's what here is on the screen. What behavior-centered design is a series of steps that can help you go from identifying your target behavior to gathering and analyzing data, to brainstorming and testing solutions, all the way to launching and assessing your results. So it starts with framing the problem, where you want to make sure that you can describe your target behavior, your target audience, and your target setting as precisely as possible. Then we move on to empathizing, where we run qualitative or quantitative research to understand an audience's behavioral motivations and the challenges that they face. This is where you really want to dig into the psychology and the social context that I was talking about earlier. From there, we go into the map step. So we map out the relevant behavioral insights that we identified in the empathize step. And we create hypotheses about our audience's behavior and the beliefs that they have to have in place for behavior change to occur. After that, we go into ideation, which is a fancy word for basically brainstorming. We create and start prioritizing sets of interventions that will generate the beliefs and behaviors that we need for our target audience to adopt new behaviors. This is where we think about things like our activities' impact on people's beliefs, their attitudes, their knowledge, the capacity that they have to engage. And once we have that program idea, we create the prototype. In other words, the how do we do this plan of essential features that we want to take to the next step, which is testing. From that point onwards, we're making sure that things are working and that any assumptions that you have are somewhat supported by your preliminary results. If not, what you do is you go back to the redesigning steps of your intervention. So you can go back to the first 5 steps. The important thing here is that you get an understanding of how your audience feels about the prototype and incorporate any revisions that you have based on your data before moving forward. The rest, though, is pretty straightforward, and unfortunately, it's often ignored by the way we do things in the field. So you'll want to launch your real or scaled up intervention. And after that, once you've launched it, you'll want to launch it in a way that makes evaluation or assessment possible. So we recently wrote a review about behavioral science evidence in the field of conservation in the environmental sector. And I can tell you firsthand that environmentalists and conservationists are great at publishing studies on species ecology or climate modeling, but we aren't so great at testing and showing causal results for behavior change programs. So I would very much encourage these last two steps here, but that's really why we integrate them into the BCD approach. Anyways, this is BCD, Behavior-Centered Design in a nutshell. It follows very similar steps to human-centered design. And while we're always making sure that we also keep a focus on behavior and the insights that we have about what drives it. So from this very short introduction, I wonder what do you, our audience here, which I think is very, very diverse all over the place, think might be the most helpful or relevant BCD step for you in your work. So there's no right or wrong answer. I'm going to open the second poll here. I have to close the other one. That's the first thing I need to do. Perfect. So it should be updating in your platform. And so I'm just curious to see where people's priorities lie when it comes to program design. So I'll just go back to this slide right before so you can see them, and you can decide which step you think might be most relevant to your work. So I see the responses going up. I might have biased a few people here with the assessment step, but you don't need to listen to me. You can choose your own. Perfect. So as I'm looking at this, I'm going to leave the poll open, but I see a lot of people are looking at the empathize step, the ideate step, seem to be a priority for most people. And those actually, the empathize one and the map one for me, are really the core of my work. And so those two steps, I think, for me at least, are the most important because that's where my expertise really rests. It's in integrating behavioral theories with the data that we collect in the field. But I think that for today, at least the 5 first steps are probably the ones that can most dramatically change the work that we all do. And they can also save us a lot of time and money down the line. So I really want to spend a bit more time on them, digging into them, so that you guys all know exactly what I mean when I talk about these first 5 steps of BCD. So we'll start with the first one, frame. So the goal of framing is to essentially tease out the most relevant actors and their behaviors from the wealth of things that can influence the environmental outcomes we are interested in. So here we're going to be using it to make sure that we're focusing on behavior, not beliefs and attitudes. They can lead to behavior, yes, but they're not a substitute for it. And we'll be doing this by asking very specific questions. So what or where is the environmental problem that you want to address? Who are the people contributing to this problem? What are people already doing or not doing about this behavior? And finally, what do you want people to do instead? There are many ways to think about this step, but what you want to, at the end of it, is to have a very specific target behavior. And I think that's something that we often overlook. That behavior, and then your target audience, will be the foundation for the rest of the other steps in BCD. So frame, something that looks very simple, but is going to be very crucial for the other steps that come down the line. So remember, you're focusing on the who and the what of your program. Once we've done the frame step, that brings us to empathize. And empathizing is all about understanding other people. So it means understanding people in and on their own terms, as well as recognizing our own biases and assumptions when we are gathering data about them. Ultimately, we enter this step curious and open-minded, and it's really a great way to ask as many things as we can before digging into program design. So what you want to understand here are the people's values surrounding the target behavior that you've identified previously. You want to think about their goals, their concerns, their interests, and specifically how they think about your target behavior and the one that they were doing before. There are many tools to do this, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. Surveys, for example, let you collect a lot of information from a lot of people. They essentially provide a snapshot of your audience, but they will never provide as much data or as much in-depth data as what an interview could provide. Focus groups are great at providing a group's perspective, And then you can also use direct observations or participant photography, which are amazing to just be in the space and see what's happening when your target behavior happens. So you can see for yourself what is happening in the communities you work with. The biggest distinction between these methods here is whether qualitative or quantitative, and that also dictates what you will be able to use the results for later. I, for one, tend to start with qualitative work to understand what's going on, and to kind of understand what are the important variables driving a behavior. And then I would do more quantitative work to validate that, take a snapshot, like I was saying, of the population you'll be working with. But every situation calls for different methods based on what you need to find out. So the important thing here of this slide is that you need to use a method that is appropriate for the data that you need and that fits your budget and time constraint. So that is that for the empathize step. And moving on, we get, basically after you've collected the data, to the third step, the process of mapping it. And this one is very, very important. This step helps you develop a science-informed behavioral solution and helps you understand what is it that you should aim to change in people's minds to change their behavior. So we often just jump from assumptions to ideas. The map step forces you to instead explain and write down why you think that behavior could change when you do something specific to it. So it's a moment to be thoughtful about what you've learned about your target audience and how it matches onto existing theories and evidence. The goal is really to build a strong hypothesis about what can drive people's behavior. So if you go back to the first scheme I presented, the map step is about building this chain of events here from context to behavior, and then leading to the environmental outcome that you seek. So in this case, a hypothesis could be that if you reduce the material barriers to shopping with a reusable bag, then you expect a change in people's bringing reusable bags with them when they go shopping. So that would be a good hypothesis that then you can test and create activities for. This, on the other hand, is an example of doing the map step, unfortunately, a little bit wrong. You're focusing on providing bags here right away with this hypothesis, and you're ignoring the context that activities should seek to address. So you're jumping right into the ideation without a hypothesis that gets to the core of the issue. So we're ignoring that green box here that I was talking about earlier that is very, very important when it comes to BCD. Here's another good hypothesis, this one focusing on social norms. It's what we think other people around us are doing. This could be a potential driver of reusable bag use in some contexts. So it's important here to think about any relevant beliefs, attitudes, knowledge, or capacity gap, as well as any behavioral bias that you might already be aware of in your target population. And this is the time to be very explicit about it. After map, you get to probably the most creative step, ideation, the part where you get to brainstorm about the activities that tie into these hypotheses that you just created. So we'll cover more about how to think through the strategies in the second part of the webinar, but the easiest way to talk about this step is to visualize it. So essentially, you want to think about any activity or intervention that will lead to the context that you believe will lead to the behavior that you want. So we're starting to add these program activities here at the fourth step, not before. And that's really what's important with BCD. You're not doing any of the program activity design until ideation. And so you want to think about as many activities as you can, the more the better. And in fact, this is a step that we say expands on the idea. So you can see that BCD goes from expanding to refining across its different steps. And so you want to be super precise for frame, but then you want to empathize and you want to find out as much as you can. In map, you want to be very precise with your hypotheses, but then in ideate, you want to come up with as many creative solutions as possible. And as long as they're grounded in behavioral science, at least. That's what I try to do. Then the next step after that, prototype, gets you to select one of those ideas and to try it. And then so on and so forth with test and launch and assess. So by the end of these first 5 steps, you should have an entire chain ready to go. This chain of events, this theory of change that I was talking about earlier. This is what we call a psychosocial theory of change. So a chain that goes from activities to the psychosocial context, the psychological or the social context that you're trying to achieve. And it's one that should then lead to behavior, or at least it's something that you can test. So that's very important. You're making hypotheses here that you can validate, and you can check if program activities are resulting in the context that you need, and if the context that you need is resulting in the behavior that you are then trying to promote. And so as simple as that, that was the quick introduction to behavior-centered design. And so I'm sure there are a ton of questions. So I wanted to see if we can prioritize a few here before jumping into real-life examples. But what I did was give you an introduction of BCD. And then in this next session, Xiang will show you how we deployed it and how you can think about deploying it in practice. So let me just see if I can see questions in the chat here. Perfect. So we have two. We have about 5 minutes before going into the next presentation. So here we have, at which point do various behavior change theories come into place, and how exactly are they used in the steps that you described? That's a great question. That's the bulk of what we tend to do here at RARE. So the first 4 steps are going to be really the creative parts of this process. You frame, then you empathize. The mapping bit is really where you start to incorporate theories with your data. So that's usually where I'm going to be looking at behavioral biases that have been documented in the literature, trying to link that up with the data we're seeing, and I'm going to start incorporating all of the behavioral science I know within that step. Then the ideation step is also very important to keep the theory and the evidence in mind. So the first one is you're creating hypotheses based on the knowledge that the field has. And then the next step is going to be about how can you basically address the context that you're trying to create. And so you can use existing interventions there, you can use evidence, you can use theory, and you can also use the data that you have. So I think a good mix of everything. The question under that now, could you please elaborate on how it differs from design thinking steps? I understand that there are several added steps. Yes, so the main bit, actually probably exactly what I was describing, so I should have read those 2 questions at the same time. So we're really forcing kind of a behavioral lens at these steps of the map and of the empathize steps. So those are going to be very, very important. And that's where we're asking everyone to stop and incorporate this behavioral lens into their work. And so Xiang is going to give you a great example of how we apply that. And then after that, after the break later today, I'm going to come back and talk about behavioral levers and how we incorporate really behavioral insights into the work that we do and at what point you do that. So we'll be covering that again later. Repost from the chat here. Where are behaviors coming from? Wouldn't that be good to know for framing? Definitely. Basically, what I was trying to say with the framing is anything that you can find that's specific about the behavior, who is doing it, where are they doing it, why is going to be figured out in Empathize, but initially you want to figure out as much as you can about your target behavior, and then the next steps are about figuring out why it happens. And the next one, how important is nudging in changing behavior? We'll cover that later today, but it's one of our strategies. I would say it's part of the toolbox of behavior change, but I wouldn't rely solely on it. And then the next question, before I can hand it off, reposting from chat also, how can you ensure that you are empathizing correctly? Example given across generations or cultures that are not your own. So that's a great question. I actually just recently had a long conversation with our team about that. So what we do essentially is we always have 2 sets of teams. We have me, who's essentially me and the rest of our internal think tank, who are kind of more the academic side of things. So we're very informed on the theories of behavior change and kind of what the science is saying. And then we always have our teams that are there on the ground. And these are the experts about the people with whom we work. And so everything is about collaborating and understanding each other's perspective and finding that middle ground. So I would always encourage to have kind of a team of experts on the behavioral sciences and experts on what is actually happening on the ground, the people that work and live with the people you are essentially working with. And then that makes it a perfect marriage to go forward with BCD. And I think one more question just before jumping. So you mentioned theory of change. Is this approach an expansion of theory of change by Frem Empathize? Just to be clear, oh, I'm not sure I know exactly what you're asking here for this one. Essentially, the first 4 steps should result in a psychosocial theory of change. The only difference from a regular theory of change is that we're really making explicit this psychosocial context, so the psychological or the social context that will lead to behavior. So that's the very, very important part, I find, as a behavioral scientist, because that's where you're not jumping on assumptions and you're really building hypotheses that you can validate on behavior. Perfect. So I think, oh, that is the time for me, and I seem to have answered all the questions. So I will now pass it on to Xian.
Okay, thank you, Philip, for the very interesting introduction. And I think now that we heard a lot about the behavior science and the terms, the concept, now it's time to get into the real case. I saw in the question and people ask about the successful behavior change cases. The cases I'm sharing today is still an ongoing cases. So we can't conclude that this is a very successful case. Just wanted to show you how we apply those BCD steps in the real cases. Okay, so in the next 20 minutes, I'm gonna introduce about one of our behavior changes project, which is Pride on Our Plates, to illustrate how we use those BCD steps. Before I jump into the case studies, I wanted to talk briefly about our work in China. We have been working in China using behavior tools to help people to protect their environment since 2007. Over the past 15 years, we have been working mostly on the conservation project in about 11 provinces in China, and we improved the habitat for 16 national protected species. And we successfully inspired 248,000 people to adopt new behaviors such as sustainable fishing, sustainable agriculture, and also to prevent the forest degradation, prevent people from poaching. And so we had a lot of past cases that can show the behavior tools that really working in China. So next, I'm going to talk about the Pride on Plates. Pride on Plates is a project that with the support of Switch Asia and in partnership with Wildlife Fund and One Planet Foundation. The goal of this project is to help the medium, micro, small micro enterprises in China to reduce the kitchen waste in the restaurants in China. So in particularly, we wanted to achieve the objectives in 4 years. So at least 350 restaurant staff will be trained with the food waste prevention practice, and among them, at least 100 of restaurants applying this SCP practice, and at least 50 restaurants will achieve their food waste by 10%. So we kick off this project in 2020. So right now we're in the year 2. Over the past year, we're mostly using the BCD steps to develop the solutions for how can we reduce food waste in the restaurant kitchens. As Philip introduced, the first step is frame. So frame for me is like X-ray, and you put on a behavior lens to understand the context related to the behaviors and understand who are behind those behavior and what is the specific behavior you wanted to target. So in about this, as to this project, let's see how we use that in the frame step. So first, for the frame, since we're talking about food waste in the restaurant, we wanted to understand to what scale food waste at the restaurant happened. So I wanted to do a poll, and it's an exercise with all of you. You can just think of 100 potatoes that produced from the field. How many of them are actually eaten by the consumers at a hotel and restaurant? You can give your estimation, but don't think it's a China-specific background. Just this is a universal situation. And I'm gonna start the poll, and you can choose the answer you think that's relevant. Can you see the poll? All right, I see people answering that. Okay, I still see the number has been changing, but the people chose the most option is between 51 to 75. That 47% people chose this, and the next option that chose most is from 26 to 50. Okay, so you are ready to see the answer? Okay, let's go. Well, the answer is 25. So actually, 75 potatoes are lost during throughout the food journey. And at the restaurant level, hotel and restaurant level, 44 potatoes are thrown away at hotel. So that is quite shocking news, and it's also help us to understand the scale of our work. So potentially, there is a lot of space for us to work on to reduce the waste happen in the restaurant and hotel kitchen. And next, we need to understand the look deep into the what happened, what's the reason caused those food waste in the restaurant kitchen. So when we zoom into this different reasons, we basically identified about 5 reasons. So they are plate waste, which is consumer throw away the food, and the food spoiled because of the expiration, and also caused by the cooking waste. Basically, so when they are preparing the food, and overproduction means that they produce the food dishes but couldn't sell. The last one is cooking error. So because due to the error, the food are rejected either by the consumer or by the hotel manager, the restaurant manager. So every type of the waste also associated with different behaviors. So we further identified about 26 different behaviors associated with each type of the waste. And also when we're looking into who caused the waste, is actually in the Chinese restaurant, every restaurant has at least 10 different positions. So we find out that every position associated with different waste behaviors. So how can we prioritize who are the most important actor? Then we ask the hotel, the restaurant staff to rank in their eyes who they think play the most important role contributing to the food waste situation. So this is a result. The top 3 group are head chef, procurement, and owner of the restaurant. So what is worth to note about here is the restaurant owner. He's actually not necessarily the one who directly produce the waste, but because he is a big influencer, so his action and his decision can also affect the whole restaurant kitchen management. So we also think this is a very important actor for us to study. So when we have those basic information about who we should go to and what type of the behavior we should look into, then we move to the emphasize step. So we visited about 9 restaurants in 3 cities, and also we interviewed all the 11 positions in the restaurant kitchen, and we conducted the in-depth interview, focus group interview, questionnaire, surveys, just as Philip mentioned that the Empathize usually use a combination of various approaches. So based on those data, we have produced a persona for each restaurant kitchen staff, and also we try to find some insights from those data. So here is what we find. So the first important objective is to find motivation and the barrier for the target audience. And we also find that the restaurant owner and the kitchen staff, two group has very different motivation and behavior pattern. So that's why we try to separate them from our research. For example, the restaurant owner, they are motivated mostly by the profit of their business and branding, the potential of the growth, and also they care about management efficiency, and also they want high staff loyalty because they will reduce their operational cost. On the other hand, for the kitchen staff, they care about different things. First is in efficiency, because in the Chinese restaurant, the kitchen staff, they're under very intensive workload. During the rush hour, their time pressure is really high. So they wanted to produce the most dishes in the shortest time. Of course, income is an important factor of their motivation. And another one is teamwork. So in those Chinese restaurants, their working relation is much closer than just a normal coworker. Usually, they are like the relationship is like an apprentice. So they have they learn from their coworker, and their performance also linked with other the people he learned from. And the last one of their motivation is working hours. So it's very often that those staff is working a long hour. So they, if anything, then can reduce their working hours, they will feel appreciated. So after we had those identified those motivation, we're also trying to find some barriers for them to prevent them from reduce food waste. So here is some barriers we get from the research. So about the managers tend to underestimate the waste in the kitchen. So we find this very interesting that when we ask the manager to estimate their kitchen waste, they will tell you that they have very little, and they believe that they did very well in the kitchen management. But when we ask about the staff that working in the front line, and they will share a lot new information that they see during their working hours, which the manager wasn't aware of. And another barrier is the manager tend to think reducing food waste will likely to increase the staff cost. And so that's why they are hesitant to take actions. The barrier related to the kitchen staff, Some of them is because waste is associated with a strong negative emotions. It's about professional ethical issue. So that's why if the waste is spotted by the staff will be usually got penalized. So that this create a lack of the motivation for staff to report the waste behavior. So based on those findings, we're trying to build some hypotheses about what our solution should base on. For example, the first hypothesis is how might we make the kitchen waste traceable and visible so that the manager can and all the staff can clearly see how much food is wasted. The second hypothesis is how might we motivate the kitchen staff to be more active or take ownership to develop their own solutions. Then the next step is to get into the ideation. And we hosted an ideation workshop with our project stakeholder. And what is most important is we also invited the chef, the restaurant owner, to participate in this ideation workshop so we can get their ideas about what they think is working in their in the restaurant industry. So based on this ideation workshop, and we further developed the prototypes that to address these concerns. So let me share some of the prototype that we have been developing. The first one is our card game for the kitchen staff. So this card game called Werewolf. Maybe some of you already heard of it. It's not only popular in China, it's also popular in a lot of Asian countries. So basically the card game, we designed a card for each, one card for each kitchen positions. And we also give a superpower of each kitchen staffs. So this will help them to feel proud about their own work. And there is also a devil, we call it werewolf, which is representing the food waste. So the whole point of this game is everybody in the kitchen needs to work together to identify who is a werewolf and eliminate it. Only by then their restaurant business will thrive. So this game will open a door for the staff to be more open to talk about their restaurant waste situation, and also be actively taking actions about what they can do about their restaurant. So this is one example about our prototype. A second prototype is a kitchen waste monitoring tool. Because we wanted to create a tool that for the restaurant owner and the staff to easily see how their waste is happening. And we also learn from several waste monitoring calculator and learn that it's very often those calculator is scientifically very valid, but in reality, because it is a new behavior for the kitchen staff, they are not they don't want to use that because they think that it wastes of their time. So we embedded a few behavior levers in the apps we design, so such as some incentive for them to do the waste, and every day after they waste their kitchen waste, and they will get some virtual orange juice just as a incentivize. And also they will have some message tell them like if you only spend 3 minutes can save you so and so much for your restaurant, and thank you for your contribution, to make them really see the meaning of the work they've been doing. So this is tools we have been tested at the restaurant, and we're gonna we're gonna promote those tools in those restaurants starting from this year in 6 cities all across China. So I hope in the next webinar, we'll be able to share some of the learning about how those tools are working in China. So this is basically a case study about how we use BCD steps. And for myself, I have been going through this BCD journey in this project, and there is a few learning that I learned from this process. The first one is we very often, I'm sure a lot of you also the same with us working on this open-ended challenge, because those kind of challenges have no fixed answer. And so it's very normal to feel stuck at some point, and that you don't be afraid of going back to the previous step and do it once over again. So this is quite normal, and you should feel right about doing this. The second learning is when you do your emphasize step, especially pay attention to the unusual behavior or reactions about your audience. Because behavior science is not like math where 1 + 1 always equal to 2. But for behavior science, that people make decisions very often based on the irrational factors rather than rational factors. So when you find something that doesn't make sense, that is exactly the places you need to look deeper and explore why it happened. And that's also, that's very often the breakthrough is happening. The last takeaway is to build behavior hypothesis and validate before you ideate solutions. And I think this point also Philip mentioned that I see very often that people was very excited after their research and they jump directly to the solutions. And then you forget to validate whether your solution is based on the behavior hypothesis. So that's something I like to share with all of you. And so hope we can discuss more later about this. So that is about my presentation. And let me see if there's any questions. Could you show some surveys and interviews you did in the emphasize steps? If you want, we can share some of the surveys after that, because every behavior research, there is a different questionnaire, different approach, but with it also following something the typical. It's also following the some same module and the methodology. And I think Philip gonna share with you the behavior levers about what motivate people. So our research is to collect enough data about those levers, and then we're gonna know what lever gonna work for the people you work with. So maybe we can come back to this question later. How did you decide on the target of the 10% food waste reduction? This is a target that was set during the project application phase, but it's also based on the from behavior science point of view. We usually, Rare has been doing that for the past 30, 40 years. And from our data, about like a 2-year intervention, if there's a 30% people adopt new behavior, that is already very good behavior impact that we're making, because not everybody change behavior at the same time. So people has different phase of behavior curve. So for this, so I think this 10% is based on the past research, and also the project resources, like what we think is realistic to achieve. And also this is just a minimum target we're aiming for. So we hope that they can save much more than 10% in reality. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a lot of presentation, and so next is a break, and we're gonna resume in 5 minutes. So Philip gonna share with you more about the next behavior lever. Thank you.
Hey everyone, so while we wait for the rest of the crowd to come back from break, I'd encourage everyone to write something that they've learned, found challenging, or that surprised them from either what I talked about or what Xiang talked about in this webinar. This might also give us a few thoughts on what to talk about in the panel if there's a lot of recurring topics or themes.
Yes, Philip, you can start now. It's 3.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Great. So thank you everyone for joining again. I hope most of you are back from break. So I'll just switch this slide. So I wanted to quickly recap what we've done so far. So at the beginning of this webinar, we learned about the basics of the BCD process. So the framework that we at RARE use to essentially create behaviorally informed behavior change programs. Then Xiang gave a great example of BCD in practice through her Pride on Our Plates work. And now what we're going to explore is the different levers of behavior change that you can use. Those strategies that I mentioned earlier that will help us reach the psychological or social context that we need to achieve behavior change. So that green bit in the schema I was showing earlier. I'll just skip this here. So if we go back to what I was talking about, the psychosocial theory of change, and all the way back to the MAP step, once you've accomplished that third step in the BCD process, you should have framed the problem, gathered the necessary data, and built your hypothesis. What remains to be done is to pick your program activities or interventions that will then result in that little green box that we have identified here. At RARE, we go about this through what we call the levers of behavior change, and that's the process that's incorporated in BCD. So these are really the core of behavior-centered design because they help us understand the different things that are changing psychologically in a person for their behavior to also change. So what is the science behind these levers? What are they? What can we do with them? This is what I'll be covering today. And essentially how we think about the context, think about the levers, and then design activities that will use these levers to result in the change that we need. So let's start with the levers of change that we're all very familiar with, the ones we all tend to rely on to some degree. What we set up here are material incentives related to certain choices. We can enact rules and regulations, or we can provide people with information about why or how to perform a certain behavior. Going into more detail, in our framework, we say that material incentives are all about money, time, convenience, or effort. So in more theoretical terms, this comes from core economic models about how people make choices and develop preferences. For example, we can increase the value of a decision if we reduce the costs associated with it, or if we increase the benefits for that decision. So we increase or decrease what we call the utility of engaging in a behavior. And that's usually how economists will think about it. The second lever, we have rules and regulations. This is really where, while not everyone follows rules, regulatory frameworks help support the behavior change work that we do because they are efficient and effective ways of communicating order in a system. So by all this, what I mean is that they help us tag choices as either right or wrong. And that's really the value of rules and regulations. And finally, we have information. It's really the favorite lever of conservation and any environmental work. Here we define it as knowledge about what the target behavior is, why, and how to do it, as well as people's sense or not of whether they can do it. So together, these form what we call the more traditional levers of behavior change. And while they have their benefits, and we've used them a lot in the last 50 years of conservation work, it's also important to understand that they have limitations. For example, material incentives can backfire. They can become the sole motivation to engage in a behavior, so they can crowd out other motivators. And well, very obviously, they cost money, right? So that's one of the downfalls of material incentives. For rules and regulations, we also need money. You need money for enforcement. And as many of you also know, rules don't work if most people in the community are not following them or if enforcement isn't very strong. So that's one of the downfalls of rules and regulations. And in the case of information, it's now been repeatedly shown that fixing a deficit in knowledge, unfortunately, rarely leads to people changing their behavior. We all have phones, we have access to infinite amounts of information, but it's still not making us all green champions, right? So put simply, intending to do something does not automatically result in action. And this is one of the big problems with information. Ultimately, though, the biggest problem with relying only on these levers is that they only have an impact on what we call rational decision-making. And let's see what I mean by that. We're going to take a short trip into psychological theory. So when we think about decision-making as practitioners, one of the most important insights and metaphors of the last 50 years has been to start looking at our decision-making as a spectrum. So from what we call system 1 to system 2 thinking. So on the left, you have system 1, which is unfortunately rather irrational. So it takes in information so quickly, we're not even aware of it most of the time. And you can think of it as always running. It's fast, it's effortless, it's unconscious, and it guides a lot of our decisions. Then system 2, on the other hand, is the part of yourself that you probably want to identify with, right? So our system 2 is very deliberate, very conscious. It's very effortful also. And it's the part that economists really, really like. It's what we like to think of as when we think of humans as computers. Now, system 2 is also the part that we expect things like money, rules, and information to impact. But you can probably already guess the problem here. While we like to think that most of our decisions are deliberate, rational, very conscious, a large majority of our decisions are actually reflexive and guided by this other system on the left, system 1. And this is also the system that is prone to biases, that follows shortcuts, or that thinks too quickly. And so we need other levers to engage with this side of our decision-making and make sure that we address the other 80-ish% of our choices that are not captured by the 3 other levers I was just talking about. So to help think about this, I'll summarize what the behavioral sciences tell us about humans. So first, it's important to remember that context matters. Psychologists, sociologists, neuroscientists, behavioral economists will all tell you it really matters. Context matters. And that is to say that simple things like how a choice is presented to people can significantly influence their behavior. Many of you have likely heard of nudging. There was a question about it. Nudges work because they alter the context of a choice without actually changing the value of the options themselves. So we'll go into examples here, but that's the first aspect of kind of the system 1 thinking. The second aspect is that humans are social animals. And because of that, we all tend to conform to the norms that we see around us. So what other people are doing, what other people are thinking, and what other people can see us to do are all things that really matter to us. And most of the time, we don't even notice how much it drives our behavior. A great example of that is think about the last 2-3 years when you enter a room and everyone is wearing a mask versus when you enter a room and no one is wearing a mask. That actually has an impact on your behavior, whether you might want to admit it or not. Finally, the last bit here, and probably the most obvious, is though we like to believe that we are deliberate and calculated in all of our decisions, emotions often overpower reason. And so recognizing these 3 truths about humans allows us to think of ways to address these things. And that's where the 3 new levers of behavior change come in. So we have here choice architecture on the left, which refers to how we can expertly design a choices context to either direct the attention to specific details, simplify information and choices, or remind people of their intentions when they're about to make a decision. Then we have social influences, which are all about highlighting existing or changing social norms and making people's behavior observable to others. The last one, emotional appeals. Here you can leverage by reframing choices around people's core values or by using personal stories instead of statistics, really to engender emotions in people. So that's great, right? But many of you are probably wondering what that looks like in practice. So beyond the bullets that I've described here. So I want to use my remaining time with you to give you a few more examples of what I mean by these three levers and what they can look like in the real world. So starting with choice architecture, as I was saying, this lever is all about influencing people's decisions through attention-getting cues, but with the caveat that it shouldn't restrict choice or change the value of said choice. So this is nudging here. One way to think about choice architecture is like a GPS system. It's a guide that gives you a recommended route of where to go. So here are target behavior, but you can always turn off the GPS or even just ignore it and do your own thing if you would prefer. So for example, here in this study, participants were presented with a scenario where instead of having 100% beef burger by default, people would get a beef or mushroom blend unless they asked for a beef one specifically. So they changed the default beef patty here. So compared to control, changing the default choice significantly reduced the likelihood that people would order a 100% beef burger. You're not forcing a choice on people, you're just changing what the default option is. And that already has a big impact. In comparison, they also did the same study with just information. It was as useful, but cost a bit more. So you can already see the advantages here of using choice architecture in some contexts. Another study here, this one at the University of Cambridge, found that doubling the vegetarian options on a menu from 1 in 4 to about 2 in 4, so about 50% of the items, increased the proportion of plant-based purchases at their cafeterias by over 80%. So a really, really big change just by making vegetarian options more prevalent on the menu. Finally, another of my favorite studies here on choice architecture, a great study that came out in 2019 showing that adding labels that translate CO2 emissions into minutes a light bulb would be on, I'll explain it, basically how long you have to keep a light bulb on to equate to those CO2 emissions, and putting those labels on different foods significantly decreased the quantity of high emission foods people would purchase. So they added labels on soup cans right next to things like price and calories and compared the conditions where no light bulb minute label was present to those that did. And you could see that a 50% decrease in the purchasing of high emission products. So these three strategies all help the end user quickly identify what to do, and that even subconsciously, which is really great. But they also all align with people's intentions. So someone who doesn't care about emissions doesn't have to follow the label. But someone who does get a little nudge on how to follow through will likely reduce their emissions by following it. So if you're a green person and you see this, it's a guide to what you should do. If you're not, you don't have to follow it. Next up, we have social influences. And these are important because as humans, we've evolved to look at what others say or do in a way to guide our own behavior. So there's two types of norms here that I think are very important. The one on the left is what we call descriptive. And it shows how I would be affected by how I perceive people and what they are doing. So descriptive influence here. And the second one on the right is what we call injunctive or reputational norms. And it shows how I would be affected by how people perceive me and what they think about what I do. So in other words, essentially, descriptive influence is about what I think other people are doing, whereas reputational ones are about what I think other people think of what I am doing. So going one extra step here. And this guides a lot of behavior. So a great example here that shows the power of both. In one of our own programs here in Brazil, we asked fishers to paint fishery conservation logos or slogans on their boats to show that they're committed to sustainable fishing guidelines. And so the sails help to show to the community that they're following the rules, and it stands to really good public commitment mechanisms where others can hold the fisher accountable because the fisher signals that he will be following the rules. So really great example here. In some research we've also done at RARE, we found that the belief that other people are doing something tends to drive certain behaviors. So this is the case for eating less meat, and you can see that compared to people's political orientation or belief in climate change, these almost had no impact on people's intention to eat meat compared to what they think other people in their community are doing. So very interesting finding here. And a more recent study also found similar results, but when it comes to meat eating, essentially people are deeply affected by what the people around them, that their close social contact, are eating. So much more than ideology, it seems as if we're really using what other people are doing as a guide for our own behavior, even though we might not be noticing it, a bit like the mask example I gave earlier. Last but not least, we have the emotional appeals, and this one can get a bit tricky. The first thing to know is that there's a strong research base that our emotions motivate us to act and are therefore very important when it comes to behavior change. So sometimes we talk about emotions as irrational and separate from reason, but we can get emotional and rational. So fear, which is the little emoji you can see on top, is very rational, right? If you see a lion or a snake in the wild, as we evolved, you would want to follow that emotion and make the right decision. But then there's other emotions like joy that are a bit more complicated. And those seem to relate to investing in certain behaviors that we are good at, developing skills, and also just persevering in certain things that are good for us. So looking at this in a practical sense, RARE uses a lot of emotional appeals, and one of them is the use of mascots. So they really help build a strong sense of identity and pride with local species and places. And they help bring people together, which is a great emotional lever to have in a behavior change campaign. Then another great study that I wanted to talk about was essentially the impact that emotions can have on choice. So this is a great example from the UK, where the grocery store Sainsbury's, for those familiar, tested alternative names for essentially meat-free sausages and mash. So just sausages put on mashed potatoes. And they found that instead of calling them meat-free sausages and mash, if they called them Cumberland spiced veggie sausages and mash, they actually increased the purchasing of these potatoes by almost 76%. And that's because saying meat-free emphasizes what is not in the packaging, and people feel like they're losing out. So if you're trying to convince someone who really likes meat that they should try this meat-free sausage, emphasizing that it is meatless is probably not the way to go. It really limits the ability of the brain to kind of positively imagine what the food might taste like. And so you won't convince meat lovers to switch to meatless by emphasizing this. You want to emphasize other language to bring out the other emotions. The final study, and I promise it's the last one, this one was looking at sending people messages highlighting the health and environmental impacts of eating less meat. Looking at participants' self-reports of meat eating, basically tapping into these health or environmental concerns had a really significant impact on people's meat intake over time. So what mattered most was not necessarily one of these three messages each, but it was tailoring this messaging to what people cared about. So if people cared about health, you tailor that message to them. If people cared about the environment, you tailor the message to them. And emphasizing this emotional connection to people's values had a significant impact on people's meat eating habits. Perfect. So there we have it, a short but in-depth overview of BCD's levers of change. So the thing that is really important between the map and ideate step, starting with the more traditional ones and going all the way to choice architecture, social influence, and emotional appeals. So we've talked about all of these. I've been talking at you for a few minutes, so I think now it's my turn to test the audience a little bit. So I have a few questions. And I wanted to see if you can identify the levers that were used in each of these examples. So I'm going to start the poll and giving you an example, and then we can see what people think these are. So for the first question, some stores offer cash and discounts for those who bring in and recycle bottles and cans. So what do we think this might be? I started the poll. I see the responses coming in. Awesome. So even without having to close this, I can already see that material incentives is winning, and you would be correct. So here is a great example of material incentives. Next one, I'll close this one and open the next poll. Oh, there are no more polls in my thing. So unfortunately, I can't open this official poll. So I will skip these, but this is a great example of choice architecture. So here you're basically reducing the default amount of food that people have. And then the next one, for 1 year, government departments competed by publicly posting energy use data, and they ended up saving. Oh, for some reason, I'm now getting my poll, so I will ignore that and keep going. And essentially, this here is a great example of social influence. So you're showing other people, other departments here what you're doing. And that's a great way to affect people that are higher up in the chain. So my parting message to all of you, there's different behavioral levers that you can use for a lot of different things, but each of them are most adapted to a specific type of behavior that you are trying to change, and they will affect different types, different parts of the psychosocial context of the people you work with. So always remember that you're not bound to one single lever. You can use a combination of many of them, but each of them has their own advantage and disadvantages. And without further ado, I think that is all for me, and I will hand on to Sam and the panel discussion.
Hello, everyone. Are you able to hear me okay? I'll just check that's working.
Yes, Sam, we hear you. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, a big thank you to Philip there for, I think what we can all say was a really insightful presentation. I'm sure has given us lots to go away and think about and apply to our work. So once again, welcome to the webinar. And now we're moving on to the next part, which is a panel discussion. So we're getting to hear from different individuals in regards to what we've just learned and how that really relates to their work. So my name is Sam Gray, and I'm pleased to have the privilege to moderate our panel discussion for today. And I'm joining from RARE, where I work alongside colleagues like Xiang Li to deliver Pride on Our Plates, while working alongside other team members to help mainstream behavior-centred design strategies to tackle environmental problems. So during the next 25 minutes, we're going to hear more about the realities of applying behavior-centred design strategies from individuals who have been engaged in 3 different areas of Switch Asia work. So that covers policy, communication, and project design and implementation. And joining us on the panel today, I'm pleased to welcome back Xiang Li, who you'll recall is joining us today from RARE's China Centre for Behaviour and the Environment. And Xiang will be sharing her insights in applying the principles of behaviour-centred design to project design and implementation. Now, I also have the privilege to introduce you to Sarah Gabai, who acts as the key expert on communication and knowledge management at the Switch Asia programme. And finally, making up our panel is Zenaida Vadiva, who is the team leader of sustainable consumption and the production facility of the Switch Asia programme. So before we jump into the exciting part of the panel discussion, I'm going to hand over to both Sarah and Zenaida to give themselves a very short introduction before we make a start. So Sarah, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can
Because
hear
I'm a
you
bit
well.
frozen. The webinar has burnt all my battery. So if I freeze, it's because of that. So I'm the communication expert at the Switch Asia program. And in a nutshell, I consider myself a very strong advocate for communication for social change, whether it is in sustainability, in sustainable development, in human rights work, behavior change. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll look forward to hearing more from you later. And Sunyada as well, over to you if you would like to give yourself a short introduction.
Thank you very much, Sam. My role overall with the SCP facility is a team leader. So we have quite an ambitious set of work on the ground through supporting the projects, which projects including Pride on our plate, colleagues of which are with us today, as well as policy support. And yes, I'm a very big advocate and believer in the behavioral insights whenever we are assisting with formulation of the project, development project or policy. And the testament to that is that I also try to derive and work with these insights in the area of education for sustainable development over 10 years in my career prior to joining Switch Asia facility. So we are hoping for the future to integrate behavioral insights in our work and assist the colleagues in integrating this sort of insights and strategies whenever they are seeing them as helpful for their realizing their ambitions. Thank you, Sam. Back to you.
Perfect. Thank you both. And before we jump into the panel as well, I want to use this as an opportunity to once again flag that we want to hear from you during the webinar. So once again, make the most of the question and answer function that we have enabled on the platform. And we're trying to take some of those questions in person, so you can pitch them to the panel at the end of today's discussion. I can't guarantee that we get to all of the questions in the panel discussion itself, but we're trying to answer those via the text function as well if we're not able to answer them in person. Great, so now I suppose that means we can begin and get into the exciting part. So I think one of the things as well that we're interested to hear about, as we mentioned there, we kind of have a wealth of experience from all of you today, obviously from across policy, communications, and the program implementation side. So what I think I'd be really interested to hear about at first is from all of your perspectives, so that's policy, communications, and the more practical implementation aspect. What advice would you give to individuals looking to start out on establishing a behaviour change programme? So what do you think is absolutely critical for these individuals to reflect on as they start out on that journey? And Xiang, if you're okay, I'll go over to you first to answer that.
Sure, thanks, Sam. So this is a really a good question. And from my point of view, so I think what is the most important thing is a reflection that people, how people make decisions is really complicated. And sometimes we know other people think and behave, but actually we don't. Let me give you an example. So during our interview with the restaurant owners for Pride Our Place, we asked one restaurant owner, so what do you say to other restaurant owners to convince them reducing kitchen waste is important? And this person, this gentleman said, all you need to say is tell them this will save money for you, and that's enough. And later we asked him, what motivates you to run your restaurant business? And he said he has a family tradition and he has an Asian Chinese restaurant recipe, and he really wanted to preserve the traditional Chinese cuisine tradition. And that's why he ran this restaurant. So it is also very similar to what we hear from other projects. So very often we work in the village, and a lot of experts told us, you need to compensate those farmers for their time if you want them to come to a training, because they only come if you pay them, pay allowance for them. So behavior science tell us it's interesting that people often think other people are motivated by material economic incentive, but think themselves are more motivated by the emotion or other factors. So that is something we very often take it for granted. If you had that clip in your mind, you will never find the right behavior solution for your project. So my first advice is clear your mind, consider yourself as a blank paper before you enter the journey on the behavior science. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. I think there's some really interesting insights there. So I guess then over to Sunyada. I'm interested to know your thoughts on that. Would you say that's something that you might recognize coming from your aspect? Would you say that coming at something with preconceived solutions or ideas or biases is something perhaps that you recognize from a policy lens?
Definitely, Sam. And let me just reiterate some of the points you and Philip have been doing before, and a little bit start with the defense of the biases. And as we know, Herbert Simon, who in 1959 received the Nobel Prize in psychology, said that while people strive to make rational decisions, they also struggle with many limitations, such as availability of time, challenges with information, challenges with perception, and simple ability to sort of to put the key factors together. So unable to make rational choices, people often resort to the mental shortcut, and this is this biases which we are talking about here, so that decisions are at all possible in a view of all limitations. So those shortcuts, often called in a science of behavioral science heuristics, another fancy word for us, coming from previous experiences, and it does indeed allow people to make a decision easier. Yet, and this is what we are talking about today, they can lead to very serious miscalculations or negative consequences, isn't it? And this is what is very well known to the policymakers who try to use knowledge of behavioral in designing policies. Unfortunately, so very often this design of policies come around the election time and not always following up on the decisions which are quite critical and important. And so those decisions definitely, as you hinted in your question, suffer from behavioral biases. So each step of the policy cycle is potentially associated with various biases and pitfalls in the decision making. Let me just mention, to overwhelm you a little bit, just a few of them. Over-optimism and commitment biases, biases in perception of information, biases in framing the problem, the groupthink, illusion of similarity are just a few of those examples, and you referred to them in your interventions, Philip, where you really sort of grouped them very nicely and associated them with levers. So each of them has enormous consequences. And just to give a little bit, to put a little bit meat on the bones, let me give only two short examples. Over-optimism bias is common in decisions of individual decision makers for the policy and also for their teams. It relates to the assumption that nothing bad can happen with plans and actions that decision makers designed, as their ability and their track record is high, so as long as they are successful. For example, the report of the National Audit Office in the UK shows that most of the governmental policies are delivered through through major infrastructure and development projects, and they looked at the 90 years of records from 1910 to the end of 2000. Spent about 30% higher than anticipated. And this is 9 out of 10 of these major projects. Isn't it interesting, really? So mitigating measures then, and this is a little bit linking to the to your levers reference, for overconfidence bias, include close engagement, of course, with stakeholders, empathic ones also, especially with critical and knowledge stakeholders, and more diligent use of data. So planning, modeling, use of expert at different stages, and use indeed of this kind of approaches as we discussed today might get us out of it. Second short example is, let's take overconfidence bias. It's very similar to optimism bias in the world of the behavioral insights teams, which comes from the UK, for example. It is another challenge to address. The bias is very significant in the field of governmental decision makers, and it often sits with top individuals. According to the research, often those top, more highly positioned individuals in the decision making in the government are often the most prone to overconfidence biases. The study from 1917, again from the behavioral insight team of the UK, asked close to 600 officials in agencies related to work with climate change some substantive questions related to climate change. And study also asked them how, in their perception, they are informed about climate change issues. Results demonstrated that people were largely overconfident in their actual knowledge, with those higher in the positions were overconfident more than those which are lower in their positions. To sum it up, in spite of evidence to the contrary, people stay currently with ideas and practices, even though they are not leading to desired results. It's certainly true for the policymakers. We have a lot of research and evidence to this. And to address this complex problems, of course, decisions are to be supported by tools and techniques which allow not only to form the decision, but also be equipped with optimization models to assess scenarios based on different parameters. So dealing with the biases is the first step in such direction. And of course, attention to the levers. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I think there's a real lot there to go away and think about as well. So Sarah, over to you as well. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts here. And, is there anything as well from a communications perspective that you might want to highlight as well as kind of being critical for those starting out on this journey?
Well, working at Switch Asia has been a huge learning process, I have to admit, because you deal with a lot of different people, experts, personalities. What I really understood, though, is one very simple thing. Behavior change needs to happen first and foremost internally, at the organizational level, at the team level, at the person level. It really does require a mind shift and a willingness to make this mind shift. So before we start thinking about communications, the way everyone knows about it, external communication, we really need to look inwards. And this is something very subtle, but very, very important. Since I took into account this BCD approach, even though I was not aware that the BCD approach was called as such, when I joined, we had to reconsider the full communication strategy, including those principles that we discussed today, to the strategy. We also had to revise our budget allocation, the role that each and every one of our teammates could bring to the behavior change communication strategy, leveraging our experience, expertise, skills, personalities. So you see how all this plays, has a huge role to play internally. And I just want to say that when I joined, I really insisted in, let's say, changing the mindset of my team members to prioritize communication almost as much as our core SCP activities. And let's say that now we are happy of how things are running because there was a willingness inside to switch mindset. So my really advice is consider communication from the start, because usually in project design, communication always comes at the end. But no, it's not a linear pattern that we should follow. It's a more circular approach. And yeah, so I think that that's a big lesson learned from working at Switch Asia.
Thank you. Some interesting thoughts there. And as well, when it comes to communications, I think that people might often think that the extent of communications in behavior-centered design is, simply correcting an information deficit to deliver change. But I think, as we touched on earlier, it can often be so much more than that. So what would you say to everyone listening from your experiences is key to really delivering meaningful communications that can aid behavior change? How would you say that people should go about integrating successful behavioral change communications into their project implementation?
I think that you used a very important word that sometimes is exploited, and you mentioned the word meaningful. So when it comes, now we talk about external communication, what every one of us attending this webinar always see from our social media, our website. So when it comes to the external communication or the implementation, we really must seriously consider how we are communicating and visualizing sustainability and SCP. Most of the times this is not done meaningfully, and doing it meaningfully, I think, really makes a difference in how people will be motivated to change their behaviors. What we see today, and sorry to say this, but we are not perfect in what we do, and also among my fellow communication experts, organizations, businesses, brands, influencers, even the media sometimes are not reporting accurately about SCP and sustainability. Sometimes it's not their fault. Sometimes they have a secret agenda behind. Also, sometimes we can lack the research, the knowledge, the facts checking. Some businesses are just into greenwashing and basically misleading consumers. So these are some of the issues we're facing. And also, visualizing sustainability is not easy. Everyone think that, it's very complicated because sustainability is abstract. And how do we bring it closer to our homes? So when we use this, I hate, the stock sustainability, sorry for the strong word, but is if you Google sustainability and click on images, you know what stock sustainability is. Hands holding trees, baby trees, green light bulbs, polar bears melting on ice. All these are cliche that are irrelevant to sustainability, that are not relatable for people. And if I cannot relate to an issue, how can I change my behavior towards it? So really, if we want to do good communication for behavior change, we really need to start bringing issues closer to home, and communicate in a way that will promote available alternatives up there. So if I ask you to change your behavior, what can I do alternatively? And we can guide people through communication on, for example, something as easy as using reusable bottles rather than drinking your coffee every day in a plastic cup, and also more complicated issues. We need to continuously explain and clarify what sustainability is, and never get bored of doing that. And this is a call to action to all the experts who sometimes have their heads very deep inside the scientific jargons of the field. And really suggesting direct interventions. At Switch Asia, we try to do this, and we have seen that our communication is understood by 24 countries in Asia, oftentimes. Sometimes when it's not, we clarify what is not understood. So we're always there, and it's a process. There is no one straightforward way. It's a process, tailor-made.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Some really interesting thoughts there as well. So now I'm going to hand over back to you, Xiang. And talking there about kind of what's successful, what isn't, I'd be interested to hear from you in regards to some behavior change campaigns or programs that you have seen in the past. Do you often see people making the same kind of common mistakes across different behavior change campaigns? And if so, what might these kind of key mistakes be?
Sure. So personally, I have been working on the using behavior approach to helping on conservation environmental projects about 15 years in my past career. And we have done a lot of behavior campaigns, and we also have seen how other people done the conservation project, and they often come to us for help. So there's certainly common mistakes we have observed. Let's just give you a few examples. The first one is very often we find that people sometimes they mixed behavior change campaign and environmental protection campaign, because environmental protection campaign the goal is to raise awareness, but it doesn't necessarily lead to actual behavior change. And so when people wanted to achieve the behavior campaign, and they sometimes they're still using the same assumption or methodology they use on the environmental protection awareness campaign. For example, we see that people often say that the target of their campaign is to make people care about environment or switch to a sustainable lifestyle. But this is too general, too broad. People don't know what do you mean by sustainable lifestyle or sustainable consumption. So instead, we should tell them, another example is you can tell people that they don't throw away the textiles. So this is better than switch to a sustainable consumption. But even for this example, it can still be improved. Instead of just saying, don't throw away textile, we can further define the behavior is recycle the textile. So the more specific you ask people to do, the easier they understand, and the easier for the behavior change to happen. So this is just one example that people tend to be so broad about their target behavior. Another example is people tend to be too narrow on another issue, which is during this, when they do the Empathize and they wanted to study on the target audience, but they very often study on the direct actors that contribute to the issue. For example, if you wanted to promote sustainable fishing, and if you are emphasize on the fisherman, how we can motivate the fisherman, remove the barrier, but that's not enough. If you look deeper into who influenced those fishermen, you can probably find other actors also important in your emphasize target. For example, the family member and who they really look into when we make decision. So those people cannot be ignored or excluded when you do conduct your research on the community. So just two examples, and I'm sure there are a lot of other examples from all of you. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Xiang. Now I'm just going to quickly hop over to one question that we've got in from the Q&A, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe Sunyaida, something you're happy to take. So this is a question, it should have just appeared on your screen. So it's a question from Kai Greenlees, and she's asked, she's interested in our thoughts about how behaviour change is currently perceived in the policy arena. And she mentions that in the UK, the behaviour change report that was to accompany the UK's plan to net zero was pulled at the last minute and not published. And she says that it seems that behaviour change is perceived as politically risky if framed that way, although policy is, of course, behaviour change. So she asked, how do we make behaviour change more tenable to policymakers?
Right. It's actually very interesting take I brought. So I don't see the question, but I'm taking the name from your reiteration, Sam. It is a little bit surprising for me that in the policy making circle, it is officially sort of, or semi-officially recognized as risky. I would speculate that it's done because it is probably affiliated with the notion of manipulation. Well, I would imagine that. I need to look at it a little bit more inside, which for me is really not acceptable argument at all, provided that so understanding of behavior can lead us to the better, to sort of to light a fire to warm ourselves or cook the food, or light the fire to build to burn somebody's house. So if there is a bit of a moral argument to that it has nothing to do with methodology. So I think it is probably quite wrong argument. Though I would be interested to know what really was the reason and motivation for not publishing this report, because especially UK is very, very famous in applying behavioral sciences in the area of policy design, particularly, as I mentioned before, and it's not only UK, at the stage where the campaigns for election are being put together. So that's very, very often when it is done. But also because behavioral science group of the UK is really knowledge inspiration for many behavioral scientists working with policy design. So that would be an unfortunate trend to sort of demonize it if it is indeed going on. Maybe one of the very interesting example in the taking on board the questions of behavioral insights and policy design would be the World Bank report from 2015, I don't think I'm mistaken, which is called Behavioral Mind, Mind, Behavioral and something. So well, forgive me for not remembering it very well, where the World Bank actually gave the state of the world a report in 2015, explicitly building on behavioral insights and giving a lot of very, very good examples how the programs and policies are actually being effectively designed based on the insights from the behavioral science theorists and knowledge experts. And those examples are given with perfect statistics, which shows what would be the improvement of those programs, which are attributed particularly in economically developing countries or allocated in economically developing countries in Asia, particularly Latin America, and in Africa. So for me, this is very, very important, though unfortunately underutilized. And now I can see Mind, Society and Behavior report of World Bank of 2015. I'm thankful to the colleagues which are sending to me the link, and they hopefully would be able to place it in the chat, or I will do it while some you're carrying conversation further. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that interesting response. Sarah or Xiang, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question as well. If not, we'll carry on. Perfect. So Sunyada, I guess while I have you here as well, is there anything else that you think is needed from a policy perspective as well to fully enable behavior change?
Well, I guess I would probably like maybe to mention it, but if you allow me, Sam, also to link a little bit to the Switch Asia program as well, as it is a bit of a manifestation of the. Of course, it is a program, but a lot of policies of regions and countries are being implemented through the program. So for us, it is quite an important question how we capitalize on this knowledge and these approaches. So let me start with, again, overstatement that too often policies and projects are designed based on narrow views and limited evidence. Though you mentioned at the beginning that, or at some point of this panel, that there is overemphasis on one particular bias of disregard of the evidence and information. So I still would like to bring it forward simply because it appears to be a chronic problem. So as a result, we don't get programs and policies which lead to practical implementation. It means, first of all, that we we need to address the biases in design by seeking really robust evidence and good stakeholders engagement. So this emphatic and broad, something which was emphasized today. Not only type and quality of information influence decision, but as you also, well, Philip in particular emphasized, and also Xiang illustrated, those are also very much dependent on how information is being framed towards loss or towards gain for the public or for the government. It is of importance for policymakers, but also has impact of acceptance of policies to the public. I'm repeating myself a little bit. Programs and policies also need to be able to have a system of correcting themselves. So, and this is when you did the first poll, I actually emphasized the evaluation and correction or assessment element. Well, I don't quite remember the name of the specific name of this stage. So mitigating measures for example, overconfidence bias, which I mentioned before, include closer engagement with stakeholders, especially with critical and with knowledge stakeholders, and more diligent use of data. So planning, modeling, use of experts at different stages of the project and policies can service as actions increasing chances of success. And attention to behavioral assumptions become very critical here. Now, this is naturally related to programs like Switch Asia, where the foundation of the program has to be based on clear understanding how change we desire can potentially happen in a particular context. And this is what you, Philip, called previously as a theory of change. Yes, it requires several core components: outcomes, strategies, actions, but most importantly, assumptions of how these elements are connected. And those assumptions can be analyzed from the perspective of behavioral insights most productively. What it means in practical terms is that what Sarah just was emphasizing, that we need to be in constant engagement with our major constituencies to verify if we understand them right. Is it, to give them voices, being present in their realities, they are in our realities in the region. So no outsourcing of any communication, for example, is allowed or should be allowed in this kind of partnership. So we need to have very close hand on the pulse. It also means, and this is my final point probably, ongoing learning on how to design actions more ambitiously and effectively to address this triple planetary crisis, as we said before: waste, climate, and biodiversity. Let me finish here.
Perfect. Thank you for that. There's some really interesting points. I think a lot to take in. So I'm just looking at the time, and I think, unfortunately, that more or less brings us near enough to the end of the panel discussion. It's gone by very, very quickly. So I think I'm going to give you one more challenge for each of you here. So if you had 1 minute to give one key bit of practical takeaway advice that you want everyone listening and joining to go away and think on or act on right after this webinar, what would it be? And Sarah, I'll go over to you first to share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sam. We learned a lot. I just want to say that really all communications should inspire some sort of change. Don't undervalue your communications, and don't underestimate and undervalue your communication officers, who are always at the front line of everything, even if sometimes we work in the back scene. And I just wanted also to announce that in the next week or so, few weeks this month, I will be sending to all participants a very cool new guide from Switch Asia on how to do communications in a way that is effective, simple, engaging. So stay tuned. I have your emails for those who registered. And I hope that you will find our guide learnings effective and useful for your work as well.
Xiang, I'm going to give the same challenge to you. One kind of quick core set of actions you want people to go away and think about.
Great. I think this is a great opportunity for us to really connect talk about, to think about how behavior change can actually help your work. I'm sure this webinar is just an appetizer for all of you. So if you wanted to learn more about behavior change, so here we offer some special benefits for participants who are on this webinar today. So here we offer a free webinar of our BCD training online module, and where you can learn a bit more about the 8 steps, and especially on frame step, we have provided a little additional information. Also, we include additional resources for you to look into. And there's the webinar video is also available in those modules. So just you can see this is on the chat box, and you can just click on the links, and using the coupon code when you log into the webinar module, the training module. So my advice is just to sign up for this free training and get to know more about behavior change. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Xian. And I've just put the link into the chat as well for anyone interested in that. So then finally, last but not least, Sunyada, any kind of thoughts or actions that you want people to go away and think about after today's call?
Thanks again, Sam. And starting with appetizers, which colleagues already offer. So we are also, as a continuation of discussion about behavioral change, we would like to alert you, all of the listeners, to the 2 webinars on the consumption, and consumption, not only the personal consumption level, but also public procurement, as well as procurement within the business sector, as 2 upcoming events. This is one, and second would be a topic of consumption and redefining the consumption in the context of academia. So those 2 will be coming, and of course information is on our website. As for takeaways, I would ask myself to start with, again, 3 major questions. What is my theory of change? In other words, what is my assumptions about relations between actions and results? And if it is working at the moment. In other words, are we doing right things? Are my assumptions about change right? And are my strategies right as well? Are my actions right? This is number 1. Number 2 is, again, and reiterating the previous half point, am I doing things right? Efficiency of execution of a program, and is it the right program? And finally, third point is, of course, how can I equip myself with better strategies and techniques to address complex problems? And now Xian and colleagues from RIP actually are offering us a little sort of step to building these competences. Thank you very much. So over to you, Sam.
Great. Well, just looking at the time, that wraps us up for today pretty much. So I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your thoughts. I think it was a lot of really interesting things for all of us to digest. And once again, thank you to Philip as well for presenting it and sharing it out with us at the start. So biggest thanks, I guess, go to all of you for joining us for today, wherever you are in the world. I hope you've found it helpful. And there's a lot for you to go away, think about, and more excitingly, apply to your work. So that's over from me. I'll hand over to Sarah for any final words. And if not, goodbye.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure. This is what good partnerships bring us to. I saw many good comments of people who were pleased with our work. All this work you can do also in your organizations with the right partners. And I really feel that you should reach out to RARE also for learning more about their amazing programs that they're conducting all over the world. And I wish you all the best success in what you're doing.
Thank you all. All right, thank you. Goodbye.